This is the fourth lecture in a series of monthly lectures drawn from these two memoirs and updated by current events. And this one discusses a trip that my wife and I made to Russia last month, in which we were asked to develop a quote-unquote good theory on how to defeat passivity and apathy in the Russian public. Of course, we weren't invited to do that by the government. We were invited to do that by the dissidents and by the friends of Andrei Sakharov. And it wasn't the first time that I've been invited to try to accomplish this. So I want to tell you about how that played out and what my theory was. But first, I want to tell you why they invited me and the history of my defense of the greatest hero of human rights in Russia, Andrei Sakharov. It all started with Edward Teller's insistence that the atomic bomb was not big enough and that while he was at Los Alamos, he wanted to work on the hydrogen bomb, which was 1,000 times larger. He got the idea for it from Fermi. He got the theoretical idea that made it possible, I think, from Ulam, but he's considered the father of the hydrogen bomb. The scientists joke that he may be the father, but Ulam slept with the mother 9 months before. So he was the man that started this, and I consider this whole idea quite evil and unnecessary. The atomic bomb was bad enough, but with the hydrogen bomb, all of mankind might be destroyed if the nuclear weapons had all gone off. The hydrogen bomb meant that after a war, you would count what was left. With an atomic bomb, you'd count maybe what was destroyed, but the hydrogen bomb put mankind at risk, and I blame Edward Teller for it. There was a spy, a Russian spy at Los Alamos named Fuchs, and he told the Russians that there was somebody at Los Alamos thinking about the hydrogen bomb, so they started thinking about it too. And their hero who invented their hydrogen bomb was Andrei Sakharov. Our hydrogen bomb was exploded in 1952, and the Russian hydrogen bomb was exploded 3 years later. And Andrei Sakharov got many medals from the Soviet government for enabling them to catch up with the capitalists and their bomb. But he turned out to be a person very unlike Edward Teller. When he told me once, many years later, that he wanted to meet Edward Teller, I said, "Academician Sakharov, you and Edward Teller are as different as scientists could be. It's like a particle and an antiparticle. If you shake hands with him, the universe may explode." Because Edward Teller was really hated by many American scientists, especially after he told an investigating committee that Robert Oppenheimer should have his security clearance lifted. Whereas Andrei Sakharov was a person of extraordinary conscience and integrity, and he immediately, after the bomb was exploded, started trying to tell the generals that they shouldn't use it. They tried to brush him aside. Then he told the Politburo that they should stop nuclear proliferation. Then he told them they should work on stopping atmospheric testing. Then in 1967, he started talking to them about, in a long memo, how they should agree to stop anti-ballistic missile systems on each side. And that was the year after I was the first to take this idea to Russia. And Andrei Sakharov later asked me, when we met later, when did you get this idea? And I said, I started in '63. He was very impressed. He had started in '67. Of course, his influence there was a lot larger than mine. And then he became concerned for human rights. And he was defending this scientist is being mistreated. This person is being mistreated. And he met a woman outside a demonstration on human rights named Elena Bonner, a woman of tremendously strong character and personality, I mean, tough. And he fell in love with her, and they had a great love affair and married. And much of the adventure I'm about to talk to you about, a lot of it involves Elena Bonner. She was Armenian, and unlike Andrei Sakharov, who had sort of grown up in a privileged laboratory for scientists, she had seen what was really going on in Russia, and she taught him a lot about how bad things were for the Russian public. So the two of them together became major campaigners for human rights. And he loved her dearly, and he protected her carefully, because many of the women in the Soviet Union, the wives of the other scientists, hated her. But he protected her and refused to meet with people without her and cherished her. By 1973, the Russian government had gotten pretty tired of Andrei Sakharov's complaints and ideas, and they were trying to reach agreement with Nixon and Kissinger on a kind of a detente between the United States and the Soviet Union, a warming of relations. And they felt Andrei Sakharov's complaints were interfering with that. And so they tried to throw him out of the Soviet Academy of Sciences, to sort of shut him up. And they started a petition which 40 academicians signed. Academician is the highest title for a scientist in the Soviet Union. There were, a limited number of academicians, a few hundred. They were considered scientific immortals. And here they were trying to throw out their greatest scientists. Now, at the time they were doing, this is the Soviet Academy of Sciences. That's their headquarters. At the time they were doing that, I was invited to Olenko, Finland, to a conference involving Russian and American scientists, a pugwash conference to talk about trying to prevent nuclear war. Most of these scientists were very senior to me then. I was about 37, but I had been a leader in this effort to stop anti-ballistic missile systems, so I was invited to this conference. I wrote a paper for the conference. It was very short and simple. And to my horror, the head of the conference, who later received a Nobel Peace Prize, came to see me and said, "The Russians don't like your paper. They want you to withdraw it." He said, "It's so clear it cannot be ignored." The paper had explained that under conditions of detente, which I was for, scientific cooperation would be imperiled on the two sides. And the reasons had to do with political theory, had to do with the fact that under conditions of detente, the Russians suppressed their scientists more to make sure they wouldn't speak up, and that American scientists were going to complain about that. So I predicted that scientific cooperation would be threatened by detente, and I later became the instrument by which that came true. So this will be part of the next slide. So anyway, I refused to withdraw the paper. I believe in intellectual freedom. That wasn't my style. And the Russian scientists promptly stopped talking to me. They were going to freeze me out. Then a second thing happened at the conference. There was a general plenary meeting, and I got up to defend Andrei Sakharov. And of course, there were 40 academicians signing this petition against him. So I said, I can prove to you that one academician can be right when all the others are wrong. I said, because 9 years ago, when I first proposed a treaty on anti-ballistic missile systems, and the Russian scientists there told me this is all wrong, I said, well, there's at least one Russian scientist who agrees with me, Art Simovich. Look at what Art Simovich said. And the leader of the scientific group I was talking to said, well, Art Simovich, he always disagrees with everybody else. So I said, but now, 9 years later, this treaty has been agreed between Moscow and the United States. And so Art Simovich was right, and all these other academicians were wrong. And that proves that Andrei Sakharov could be right, and all these people attacking him could be wrong. So everyone applauded warmly, except the Russian scientists, who sat on their hands and later said that I must be a trained political propagandist. So now this is a small thing, but it had a big effect. And the effect was that in the Academy of Scientists in Washington, they were listening closely to what was happening to their delegation in Pugwash in Finland. And they heard that on 2 occasions, something had happened that offended the Russian scientists, but they had not walked out. The American scientists at that time were quite intimidated by the Russian scientists, and they sort of assumed that if they insulted them in some way, that would be the end of the conference. But under conditions of detente, which was a new kind of political condition, the Russian scientists had different instructions, and they weren't permitted to walk out because they were supposed to encourage detente. So these American scientists, the leaders of the National Academy of Sciences, they realized that Stone had stood up to these scientists and they hadn't, walked out. And so they felt free to begin defending Andrei Sakharov. So they wrote a letter of their own to defend Andrei Sakharov. Now that was a big thing because this was the National Academy of Sciences. That's what the Russian scientists wanted to deal with. I began to develop my ideas from a theoretical point of view, and I wrote a newsletter on the responsibility of scientists under conditions of detente. And of course, the federation that I was leading, I was president of the Federation of American Scientists, and they had been founded by the atomic scientists. So their first goal was to do something about nuclear war, you know, that was the main goal. And I developed the theory that when the Cold War was very tense between the two sides, then our federation should just worry about nuclear war. But if there were conditions of detente and the danger of war was somewhat relaxed, then we should also take as a priority defending the rights of our colleagues abroad who were repressed unfairly, intellectually, and in other ways in Russia and in other countries. Now, this was in the middle of a gigantic political struggle in Washington between Henry Kissinger and Nixon, who wanted detente, and Senator Jackson and conservatives who didn't want detente. And so my small role in this was mentioned in the Washington Post in 5 paragraphs. It seemed very interesting. The scientists were defecting a little bit to defending human rights of scientists. And the State Department asked me to give a talk. I spoke at the Open Forum, that's the State Department, and explained what the Federation's evolving position was. After the talk, I left something behind in the room. I went back in to get my suitcase, and there was nobody there except one man under the table. I said, "What are you doing under the table?" And he was obviously removing a listening device from under the table. My words were of such significance that some government agency was recording them with a device under the table. I was pleased and impressed. So then I took this newsletter I'd written on the responsibility of scientists under conditions of detente, and I mailed it to 125,000 scientists, the entire list of the Science magazine, which was the membership of the American Association for the Advancement of Science. And I said, look, if you like what we're doing, what we think, you know, sign our petition, and best of all, join us, because this is an expensive mailing and we need money to do it. And 2,000 scientists signed our petition, which was a good return for direct mail, and 800 joined the organization, paying $25 and therefore paying for the mailing, so the money I had risked was saved. And we sent this petition to this man, Ambassador Dobrynin. This is the Russian ambassador at the time. He had been there for a long time and was a relatively sympathetic figure. He knew the Americans quite well, and he wasn't put off by petitions and the kind of things we consider normal in Washington. And so then he would mail what we would send him on to Moscow, and it would show the Russians that we were serious about defending our colleagues in Russia. Now, about this time, in 1975, the Helsinki Agreement was signed, and all the European countries and Russia and the United States agreed to a lot of rules, including intellectual freedom. And I thought, well, this is a good time to go to Russia and see if it's going to make any difference. Are the Russians going to accept their obligations under the Helsinki Agreement? At that time, I was the president of the Federation for 30 years, but I had chairmen to deal with. And the chairman at that time was very left-wing, and he didn't think I should go to Russia. He said, look, you're going to play into the hands of the anti-communists. They're constantly complaining about Russia. It keeps the Cold War going, and we shouldn't be part of that, and we should just work on nuclear war. And he was worried about what would happen if I went to Russia and came back inspired to do still more. And of course, he was right about that. But I was a very strong president of the Federation at that time, and I couldn't be stopped. So I went to Russia, and it was quite moving. First of all, I met this man, Valentin Turchin. Now, he was a mathematician and cyberneticist, and he had started an Amnesty International chapter. You have to understand, at that time in Russia, there were no chapters of anything. There were no independent groups not run by the Communist Party on anything, except one group on human rights, with which Andrei Sakharov had started. In other words, they weren't used to anything that wasn't government controlled. When the U.S. Embassy realized this man had started a Moscow chapter of Amnesty International, which means a group devoted to freeing political prisoners, they were astonished. You know, so he was a very brave man. And I'm proud to say I later saved his life by getting him out of Russia in a way that I will explain in a minute. So then Turchin helped me go visit Andrei Sakharov. I went to Andrei Sakharov's dacha in 1975. And he had a, he was a very well-off Russian. He had a big dacha near the Ministry of Defense's dacha. All the wealthy, not wealthy, but famous Russians had dachas there. And at that time, his wife, Elena Bonner, had been in Europe getting an eye operation. She had refused to have this eye operation in Russia because she knew that the government hated her and Andrei Sakharov, and that they might wreck the operation and blind her. So she didn't trust the doctors, and they didn't want to give her a visa. And before I left, I had seen something in the Washington Post, just 3 inches, and it said that Andrei Sakharov had gone on a 3-day hunger strike in order to protest the fact that his wife had not been given the visa. So I thought, well, I should try to do something about this. So this is another example of where a small thing can make a large difference. I had been invited to Moscow at that time by the World Federation of Scientific Workers. They were a federation of scientists, very left-wing, really a Soviet front group. I had been at one of their meetings and didn't want to join them, but they wanted to have an American affiliate, and they badly wanted the Federation of American Scientists to come to their conference. So I hadn't been planning to go, but seizing the opportunity, I called the Soviet embassy and I said, the World Federation of Scientific Workers is having a conference in Moscow. They've invited the Federation to come. I am not going to come unless Elena Bonner gets her visa. So when by the time I got to Moscow, she had the visa. But when I walked into Andrei Sakharov's dacha, I said, well, Academician Sakharov, it's very nice that your wife got this visa. We think we helped in this. And he looked at me as if, well, this is a bold young man. There had been a worldwide storm of protests trying to help his wife get this visa. And here was this kid, telling that he may have helped. And so he was a kind man, a sweet man, really, in his way. Well, I don't know exactly how to describe it, but he didn't want to say anything rude, so he told a little joke, a true story. He said, well, you know, Dr. Stone, 2 different famous people complained to Brezhnev on behalf of my wife. One was the King of Belgium, and the other one was Willy Brandt of Germany. Meaning, where were you in all this? And I said, well, Academician Sakharov, do you know the significance of the date, August 19th, the day she got the visa? He said, no. I said, well, that was the last day of the conference of the World Federation of Scientific Workers, which is the conference we were boycotting, and they had been told by us that we wouldn't come unless she got the visa, and they were obviously complaining too. So he was impressed by that, I mean, obviously I didn't do the whole thing myself, but he saw that I had done something. And later he told a visitor that Stone is articulate, creative, and brave. I plan to put this on my tombstone in due course. If anybody forgets, please remind them. And this is Burhop. Burhop was the head of the World Federation of Scientific Workers. And so he was the man that was relaying our pressures to the Soviet government. Now, while I was there, I had some moving experiences. First of all, in Russia at that time, there were a group of Jewish scientists called Refuseniks. They were called Refuseniks because they had asked to go to Israel, and in return, the government had said, well, you can't go to Israel, and in addition, we're not going to employ you anymore. So they were out of work and not allowed to leave. Our federation later adopted a position saying, look, if scientists aren't allowed to work, they should be allowed to leave, if for no other reason. Anyway, they were having their own seminar. I went to the seminar and spoke at it, and I was very moved by their plight. They were out of work, and they couldn't leave. So that was one thing, these Refuseniks. And the second thing was I met with this man, also a Refusenik, Benjamin Levitch. Now, Levitch was a very clever man, and he told me 2 things, which, as you will later see, ignited a political firestorm in Washington, and which I think he well knew would create a major disturbance helpful to their plight. Levitch had been the deputy head of the chemistry department in the Academy of Sciences, and he told me that once a representative of the Communist Party had said to him, look, Levitch, the chairman of the committee, he's Armenian, and you're a Jew. It's too much. This is a Russian country. We can't have an Armenian and a Jew, the top two positions in the chemistry department, so you can't continue as the deputy head of the department. This was Russian chauvinism, you know, writ large. But he told me two other things. First of all, he pulled out a book and he showed me a statement Albert Einstein had made in Germany when the Nazis were persecuting Jewish scientists. A very moving statement from Albert Einstein saying people should not remain silent. So I took note of that. And then he told me something even more inflammatory, really. He told me that the president of the Academy of Sciences in Washington had come to Russia to talk over scientific exchange with the leaders of the Russian Soviet Academy. And when he asked to see the Refuseniks or, you know, Levitch, people like that, they had said to him, you know, don't do that. You know, the government wouldn't want you to do that. That could interfere with things, you know. And they talked Handler, they talked our president of our academy out of doing it. And of course, these people were affronted. President of the American Academy of Sciences has come here and doesn't meet with them. So they told me that. So I was very excited. I paced up and down on the airplane most of the flight, thinking about what to do about this. And I did something, and it led this president of the National Academy of Sciences to demand my resignation. Of course, he wasn't a member of our group, but he wrote a letter to my chairman, 7 pages long, full of colorful language, accusing me of yellow journalism. Now, in order to explain the full, he was an imperious man with a terrific vocabulary, but in order to explain the full vehemence of his attack, which later worked well for me, I should tell you that 3 things had happened before the final complaint he had. The first one was that the Federation of American Scientists was a small voluntary group. People paid $25 to join. We had 5,000 scientists. He had 1,000 scientists, but they were elected. They were the most brilliant and able scientists in the United States. And so he felt he was the voice of science in the United States, and this was a young upstart organization, and it looked like there were going to be 2 voices of science in Washington, and he didn't like that. So that was one problem. And the second problem was that my mother and I and my father had met with Albert Einstein at his home when I was a teenager, and as part of that visit, Albert Einstein said to my mother and to me, I hope they never make a monument to me in Washington. He considered Washington a kind of political cesspool. He considered my father a kind of political hero. That's why we were there. And he didn't want a monument to himself in Washington. And this man Handler was proposing to build an enormous statue in front of the National Academy of Sciences of Einstein. So I put my mother on television announcing that Einstein didn't want this. And the executor of Einstein's estate, at my instigation, said, why don't you give the $1 million to Princeton, where we need the $1 million to publish Einstein's collected works. So in the end, the money dried up for Handler, and he had to sell Audubon prints, rare prints, to finance the statue. So he was sore about that too. And then there was a third thing. I got a call a month before I left for Russia. I got a call from the head of the disarmament agency, a man named Freddie Clay. Fred was a friend of mine, but a high government official. He said, Jeremy, I need help. I didn't usually get requests for help from government officials like that. So I said, what do you need? He said, well, we gave a academy study, we gave a grant to the National Academy of Sciences to discuss how bad would nuclear war actually be. And of course, they assumed the Academy of Science would say bad, 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 and terrible, and they could use that in their propaganda against nuclear war. But actually, when this man wrote a cover letter for it, he somehow wrote that our study shows that, as far as we can tell, not every human being would be lost. So Freddie Clay said to me, can you do something about this? This is not what we had in mind, you know. So I drafted a press release. It went further than it should have. It said the National Academy of Sciences has no public policy sense, which I shouldn't have said. And And then it said after 18 years, they're trying to answer On the Beach, which is the movie where everybody died after a nuclear war. So Handler was very embarrassed and had to call newspapers up and say, I didn't really mean this, and please don't print that. So he was quite sore about that. But the fourth thing that happened after my trip was, I wrote a newsletter about my trip, you know, who's who I talked to, here's what I said. I put a little box in there showing what Albert Einstein had said about keeping silent. And then I put in a little box that Benjamin Levitch had told me that this man had gone there and not met with the insurgents and the dissidents. I called the press secretary at the Academy and said, does Handler want to make a comment on this? This is what I'm going to say. But Handler didn't call me to make a comment, so I just printed it. So Handler wrote this 7-page letter denouncing my newsletter. He said he's lobbying against us as if we were an enemy organization. He hasn't asked me to consult on what I did and why, which is cheap yellow journalism, he said. Although I had asked, but you know, I hadn't pursued him personally. And so he wrote this very inflammatory thing, sent it to my chairman. And the Science magazine thought, wow, this is big news. The Federation of American Scientists and the National Academy of Science are fighting. Handler and Stone are fighting. And they wrote this long article about what had happened. I asked a famous journalist to read the article and tell me what he thought of it. And he said, well, you won. He read it and he said, you won. And so I thought, well, that sounds pretty good. But it had been in Science magazine, this article. So these 125,000 members had read this article. But the article had not explained what the real substantive issue was. It was just about what he said and what I said. So I thought, good opportunity. I wrote a letter to the same 125,000 scientists saying, well, here's the meaning of what you read in Science magazine. Here's what we're trying to accomplish. You know, join us, help us. And as a result of this, especially because he used such colorful language that caused, you know, such a big article to be written about it, this really changed. It changed really. Let's see. This is a little premature. It changed the complexion of the scientific community's political attitudes. In the past, it had been presumed in the scientific community that scientists did science and they stayed out of political things. And by political things included defending the human rights of their colleagues. That was the presumption. And for that reason, the Academy of Sciences had no committee dealing with the human rights of scientists. At that time, only the American Physics Society had such a committee. But by the time we finished writing to all these scientists and writing to these different groups, all these groups had committees on human rights, including the National Academy. So the presumption then became good scientists do defend the rights, human rights of their colleagues abroad, and the whole attitude of the community had been changed. So this was the run-up to a fairly important thing. We then began to defend individual scientists with mass mailings. This is Coval F, a biologist, very brave, who had been put in prison. And this is Tverdoklevov, a physicist. And there was another one, a mathematician named Plush. Plush was in a psychiatric institution. In Russia, they had the ugly habit of saying, if somebody disagrees with us, he must be crazy. Let's put him in a psychiatric institution, you know. And then they would drug them. I mean, it was a terrible thing. And so we wrote to all the biologists about Coval F, all the physicists about, I was getting good at direct mail, all the physicists about Tverdoklevov. And then with Plush, we told the Russian ambassador, well, you've heard about Coval F, you've heard about Tverdoklevov. We have the list of the Mathematics Society now, and we're going to mail about Plush unless he's released. And he was released. And I got word from Moscow that we had saved this man from a prison sentence. He was just given internal exile instead of a prison sentence. This man, under Gorbachev, was later put in charge of human rights for all of Russia. So we were defending important people, you know, people that were not nuts. And so the U.S., as I said, the professional societies set up human rights groups, and the House Committee in the House of Representatives, they began an investigation as to whether they should cut off scientific exchange with Russia, because we had highlighted all this repressive activity. So I testified before them. And I said, look, don't do that. That's the last thing in the world that you should do, because then we won't have any contact with the Russian scientists. We won't be able to help them. We don't want that, and we want scientific cooperation. I said, I've invented something different, and with my invention, we can take care of this ourselves. I invented the idea of the American Refusenik. And I had been putting in my newsletter to scientists, if you support people in Russia, a colleague in Russia who's repressed, adopt him and become an American Refusenik and say, I will refuse to cooperate with Russia individually until the person I have as my individual colleague gets his rights. So that we would create a web of individual contacts and individual threats to break off cooperation, but we would fend off a collective break off of cooperation, which of course would have been a major mistake. So in the House of Representatives, I was able to defend this thing against an unfortunate possible backlash. Now in 1975, Andrei Sakharov got the Nobel Prize for Peace for all his defense of human rights in Russia. A pretty extraordinary thing to get the Peace Prize for a man who had invented the hydrogen bomb, but he did it. And at that time, I got a secret appeal from Mrs. Bonner. It was sent to me by a psychiatrist, and I didn't really understand this appeal. The psychiatrist said, well, Mrs. Bonner is asking you to put out a press release demanding that Andrei Sakharov and his family be allowed to go to Europe. And he said, the psychiatrist said, you know, I'm not sure that Andrei Sakharov wants this. And I think Mrs. Bonner may want you to pose this issue as an effort to leverage her husband into agreeing to leave Russia. Andrei Sakharov was a great Russian patriot, and he loved Russia, and he wanted to stay in Russia and continue doing what he was doing. So I thought about it, and I declined to cooperate in this because I felt I was being manipulated by Mrs. Bonner. And so in and I guess I've already told you about my meeting with Sakharov in '75 when Mrs. Bonner was in Europe getting the eye operation. So afterwards, she went and accepted the Nobel Prize for Andrei Sakharov because they wouldn't let her out. So I told you about my meeting with him. And 4 years later, he did something which drove the Soviet government up the wall. I mean, it was more than they could bear. They had invaded Afghanistan. Apparently, they considered invading Afghanistan 11 times and turned it down 10 times, but on the 11th time, they got the idea that the Chinese were going to get involved in Afghanistan, and they felt that there would be Chinese encirclement. You know, the Chinese already had a long border with them, and they became very frightened about this. So this, I believe, was the precipitating reason why they invaded Afghanistan. But in any case, Andrei Sakharov protested this. He was a man for peace. He said, why are we joining this war? Why are we invading Afghanistan? And the Politburo, whose decision to invade Afghanistan had put detente absolutely on the rocks, you know, and had broken their warming relations with Nixon and Kissinger and wrecked the SALT II treaty, and, you know, it was a big step for them. They were horrified. Their famous Andrei Sakharov was helping the enemy by complaining about our invasion of Afghanistan. So they said, we got to do something. We can't shoot him and we can't put him in prison. So they decided to put him in exile, internal exile, and they sent him to Gorky. This is the home of Maxim Gorky, the famous poet and writer, who lived in a town then called Gorky. And Gorky had a secret aviation factory, so no foreigners could be there. So the Russian government thought, good, we'll put Andrei Sakharov in Gorky. The foreigners will not be able to meet with him. That'll shut him up. He won't be able to make contact with these dissidents. We'll be freed of his incessant complaining. And so they put him in there. They wiretapped his house, and they flew helicopters over it. They monitored it. If the trash was piling up, all Mrs. Bonner had to do was say, Andrei, there's so much trash around here. And immediately the trash would be collected because it would be picked up on the wiretaps. And I started sending, I asked the editor of the Bulletin of the Atomic Scientists, another collegial group, I said, let's go, ask to go to Gorky and see Sakharov. So we applied to the Russian embassy, said we want to go to Russia and see Sakharov in Gorky. And they, of course, politely refused, and I, of course, got quite angry, and I broke off relations with the Russians. I said, we're not going to deal with you anymore. Now, that was a big step, probably a moral error, because we were working on disarmament, you know, and nuclear war was an overriding problem, and his exile was one man in exile, you know. Nevertheless, I was angry. And so for 3 years, I boycotted the Russians over this. During that time, I kept sending secret messages to Sakharov and getting secret messages back. The reason I was able to get the secret messages to and from was, I later realized, was that Elena Bonner was living with him, but she was not in exile, so she would go back and forth to Moscow to get goods for provisions and things like that, and she would carry these messages. I got one message back saying, Dr. Stone, I've heard you defending me on the Voice of America. And of course, I wondered how he could do that because he was, the KGB were jamming his apartment, so he couldn't listen to things in the apartment. But he said, I have a portable shortwave radio, and in the Gorky Park, I could hear you defending me on the Voice of America. These letters are, you know, very valuable, famous letters that are now in the Russian Museum on Andrei Sakharov. And so he then, in 1981, a year later, he began a 17-day hunger strike. That's a long time. On the third day of this hunger strike, I saw a small notice that he was on a hunger strike, and I tried to get the press to write about it to help him, and I wasn't getting any traction. So I sent him a telegram, and I said, Western Union, you know, I said, Academician Sakharov, we're not getting any response to your hunger strike. Please call this off. The world needs you. Well, the KGB, I think, let this telegram through because they wanted him to stop the hunger strike, and here was a friend of his appealing to him to do it, so they let this through. And that was on the third day, fourth day of the hunger strike. 4 days later, I got a telegram back from Andrei Sakharov. He'd gotten sort of out of bed on this hunger strike and gone to the telegraph office and sent me a telegram back. And the telegram said, you must understand, these people cannot be trusted. I cannot stop this hunger strike. You know, I'm not going to desist, and so on. So this was on the 8th day of the hunger strike. I got this notice that he wasn't going to stop. But I was still desperate because I thought 8 days without food, it seemed to me an enormous amount, and I couldn't get the press to make a move. I complained to a correspondent. This is another example where a small thing makes a big difference. I complained to a correspondent. I said, what can I do? He said, oh, I'll tell you what to do. I said, what? He said, tell the foreign desk at the Washington Post and the foreign desk at the New York Times to query their correspondents in Moscow to write about this. They will immediately do it. And indeed, 2 days later, there was a big story in the Washington Post about the hunger strike from Moscow. You see, I wasn't smart enough to realize that nobody in Washington wanted to write about a Russian hunger strike, and they didn't know how to write about it. What would they say? But the correspondents in Moscow knew how to do it. So the New York Times and the Washington Post ran big stories, and at that point, everybody knew about it, because those stories were run in the Post and the Times. So then I had ammunition. It was the 10th day of the hunger strike, and I got in touch with Secretary of State Vance, who was retired, and he agreed to support my campaign. I got in touch with Henry Kissinger. He agreed to support the campaign. I got in touch with Averell Harriman. His wife said, we don't get involved in these things. Pamela Harriman didn't hold with this sort of thing. But I said, I want to talk to Averell Harriman anyway, and I talked him into it. And then Ronald Reagan said something. And Linus Pauling, who was one of my scientists, and who had been an honorary member of the the Russian Academy of Sciences, he agreed at my suggestion to say, I'm going to quit your academy if you don't do something. So all these people started complaining, and on the 17th day, the Russians gave in, and they gave Andrei Sakharov what he wanted, which in this case was a visa for his daughter-in-law to leave Russia. Sakharov was on about 5 hunger strikes, and he defended a lot of people with human rights, but most of the hunger strikes were about his family. And 2 or 3 of them really induced by Elena Bonner. I felt very badly about this because it really sapped his strength. Now in 1983, I was in Moscow. I had dropped the boycott because Reagan's Star Wars had created what was for me an international emergency. I knew the American scientists were against Star Wars. I knew the Russian scientists were against Star Wars. And I realized we had to talk to each other to see what could be done about this. It was a threat to disarmament because if each side built anti-ballistic missile systems, the other sides would build more missiles, and the arms race would be of redoubled ferocity, and a lot of money would be wasted and dangers created. So, so I went to Moscow, and I arranged a secret meeting with Mrs. Bonner. Secret meeting meant I went to the Russian embassy. American embassy. I got up really early in the morning, so nobody would know to follow me. I went to the American embassy, waited. Then the American ambassador had signaled her to show up at 9 o'clock, and we got together. They put us under a cone of silence. How many people know what a cone of silence is? If you've seen Get Smart, you know, out of fear of being bugged in these embassies, they would put the two close together over a table. They would pull down a cone of silence over you. They would put cold air passing through and other things to try to make sure that even though you were in the embassy, you were not being listened to. I can tell you it was freezing. So I gave Mrs. Bonner a computer that Andrei Sakharov could make 600 programming steps on. By that, Hewlett-Packard was selling them cheaply. And I gave some presents, and she gave me a letter she wanted given to the Academy of Science. And we had a heart-to-heart discussion. And I explained why I dropped the boycott, which from her point of view, she didn't believe in arms control, I think, and she smiled indulgently, but I think she didn't believe my negotiations with the Russians would mean much or come to anything. But she just wanted the defense of Andrei Sakharov, but she didn't protest. She said to me, dissidents in Russia, Jeremy, they're like a grain of sand that suddenly shows up to be a diamond. In other words, the machine is trying to crush all these grains of sand, but occasionally one of them can't be crushed, of which she was an example. Now then, the next year, Andrei Sakharov sent me a private letter. This private letter was delayed in transmission for 5 months. It happened this way. Andrei Sakharov gave it to Elena Bonner. She went to the U.S. Embassy. They sent it to her children in Boston, whom I knew, and they were supposed to translate it and give it to me. They kept stalling and stalling. It's just a letter. I said, where's the letter? They were even staying overnight at my house once in Washington. I said, where's the letter? They said, oh, you know, we haven't finished translating it or something. Finally, they gave me the letter, and I saw Andrei Sakharov's threatening another hunger strike, and they haven't given me this letter. I gave it to the Washington Post. The Post correspondent called these kids in Boston to inquire about the letter, and they said, oh, don't publish that. I realized that the Sakharov family didn't want me to have the letter. They didn't want the press to write about the letter because they were afraid the publicity about this letter would provoke Andrei Sakharov into another hunger strike. And Elena Bonner may have wanted the hunger strike because it was a hunger strike to try to get her a visa for another medical operation, but the children didn't want it. Anyway, then he threw the hunger strike. He started the hunger strike, and it went on for 6 months with a 2-week break. Once the hunger strike started, I gave this letter to the Post and the New York Times, and as you can see, it was big news. This is the front page of the New York Times. This is the letter sent to me. See, that says, Dear Dr. Stone, for those of you who speak Russian. There's the letter in Russian. Here it says, Sakharov letter to American, you know. Here's a front page picture of Andrei Sakharov. Sakharov's plan to aid his wife revealed to U.S. So this was big news in the Times and in the Post. And Andrei Sakharov's weight dropped from 175 pounds to 138 pounds during this hunger strike. Now, on the way to Moscow in 1983, I was at a conference with an aide to Senator Kennedy, and I told the aide that I was going to Moscow, and he said, oh, would you take a letter to Moscow for academician Velikov? We want to invite him to Washington to testify on global warming. And I said, sure. Velikov, as you'll see, I considered a really great guy. He was the only scientist in Russia whom, when we would talk to him with some idea, he would say, I'll try. All other scientists in Russia would go like this and try to, avoid involvement in some foreign scheme that might get them into trouble. But this man had tremendous standing in Russia. The Politburo relied on him. He was a candidate for the presidency of the Academy of Sciences there. And he was then and is now the president of the Kurchatov Institute on Nuclear Energy. So he had standing. When you went into his office, he had 6 phones on it. One of them was a red phone to the Politburo. So, so he came to testify with Senator Kennedy, and that's a picture that I took of him at that time. This is Velikov, and this, of course, is Senator Kennedy, and I took this picture. Now, I went to see Kennan, George Kennan. I took Velikov. He was my guest. I was his host. I took him to Princeton, and I introduced him to George Kennan, the great American former ambassador to Russia and the great historian, whom the Russians consider to know more about their history than they do. And it was very interesting for them. And while we were on that trip, I had a great idea. I realized that when Senator Kennedy went to Moscow, the Russians would give him a present. Usually it was 5 or 6 refuseniks. They would give visas to people in return for Kennedy going there. You have to understand that the Kennedy family was extremely popular in Russia. I used to go to Russia with Kennedy $50, which I would give to people, and they would hold them against their chest, against their heart. And they considered him, you know, a force for peace, a force against the arms race, the Cold War, and they knew about the assassination, of course. And so Kennedy was very popular there, and the Politburo knew it. So they knew that if Senator Kennedy visited the Politburo itself would get a certain added prestige by having as a guest someone so popular in Russia. So they always wanted Senator Kennedy to go. And they would give him something, you know, he would demand something, and they would give him some dissidents would be freed. So I said to Velikov, I got an idea. Why don't we tell Senator Kennedy to bargain for academician Sakharov, to tell the Russians he'll go to Russia and talk to the Politburo if they'll release Andrei Sakharov in his care and let him go to America, which was a great idea, because for Kennedy it would be a great triumph, you see. So, and for the next 3 years, Senator Kennedy bargained with the Russians back and forth over this idea secretly. He had a doctor working on his staff named Horowitz, and Horowitz would occasionally say to me, it's up, it's down, it's up, it's down. The bargaining was going up and down, and during this time, Russian leaders were dying like flies every few months, and it was very difficult to get these negotiations going. At one point, in '85, I took a letter from Senator Kennedy to Moscow and delivered it, and it indicated that he wanted to play a role in solving this Andrei Sakharov problem, and could they please cooperate with us, and so on. So we were all doing our best here. But after 3 years, it didn't seem to be working, so Kennedy decided to go and complain about Sakharov while there. And I told Mrs. Bonner, who was then in Boston, what we were doing, and she said, it's okay. She said, tell Senator Kennedy I won't complain about him. When I told this to Senator Kennedy, I mean, he almost fainted. I mean, the temerity of it. He had spent 3 years trying to do this, and she was saying grandly, I won't complain about you if you do this. And she said it would be all right if you demanded he go just to Moscow, not all the way to America. Now, in 1987, Andrei Sakharov was released from Gorky under Gorbachev. The whole Soviet Union situation changed enormously when Gorbachev took over. Gorbachev believed in completely different things. He'd been hiding what he believed in for years in the doublethink that the good guys in Russia were forced to do under the Soviet Politburo. And so he had released Sakharov, and I was standing in the Kremlin when they first met. And I took this picture. I almost lost it, as you can see. This is President Gorbachev, and this is Andrei Sakharov. You can see what a lousy photographer I am. And I was standing there because we were all at a conference on the survival and development of humanity, which Velikov had started, and Gorbachev was sort of presiding over. And 15 of us had been invited to a round table to talk to Gorbachev, and that's why we were in the Kremlin. And I heard their first words. Academician Sakharov said, "It's nice to have freedom and responsibility again." He didn't say thank you, but he said it's nice to have freedom and responsibility again. And quick as a flash, Gorbachev smiled and said, "It's good that you recognize that with freedom goes responsibility." Because he was afraid, you know, Andrei Sakharov might say something that would set all of Russia aflame. And during the meeting, Gorbachev showed what a brilliant man he was, because he said, well, everybody can ask a question, and 15 of us around the table all asked a question, and he just took notes on a yellow pad. And after that, he went around the table giving answers to everybody. Good answers, too. So he was a trained lawyer. He was completely different from previous Soviet leaders. And he even won over Sakharov for the moment with a very brilliant answer to him. Then later, a few days later, I met with Sakharov, and we devised an agreed position on Reagan's Star Wars position. He and I had very similar ideas about what to do. His was a little different than mine. Mine was the one eventually adopted, but he was very pleased, and so was Elena Bonner, that we had the same position, and she even thanked me, which was very unusual. And then he died 2 years later. I think all these hunger strikes had sapped his strength. And then 2 years after that, the Soviet Union collapsed. Now in 2006, I was in Russia, and the Kremlin, Putin was then in charge, and the Kremlin was trying to get in control of everything. But Putin had I should say something about Putin, which you may not fully understand. When the Soviet Union collapsed, the American advice was shock therapy and privatize everything. And this was carried out. But it produced tremendous tragedy in Russia. So much tragedy that capitalism and democracy are, in large parts of Russia, dirty words, because what happened was, first of all, that when they privatized things, very few people had any money to buy the things. There were a few smart guys who looked at these new regulations and said, hey, we can start a private enterprise. Hey, we can start a bank. Hey, what is a bank? Oh, well, a desk could be a bank. Ask them for money, promise to pay it back. That's a bank. So they would set up banks. They would collect money. Then they had money. Nobody else had money. So then they would buy all the gas resources of Russia for a song. And pretty soon, 7 billionaires in Russia owned half the GNP of Russia. Well, this didn't go over too well with the average Russian. Furthermore, the ruble collapsed. So people lost their life savings, you know. They were impoverished immediately. You can't believe how bad it was. I was there during that time. I rolled down a taxi window and offered a woman a 100 ruble note. That's $3. And they were standing on the street selling shoes or selling something, you know, to get through the day. And I rolled up the taxi window. She rushed up to it and kissed the taxi window for this gift of $3. That's how broke they were. And people weren't being paid their pensions. They weren't being paid their salaries. Russia was flat on its back. And Yeltsin was told later that, you know, only 3% are going to vote for you. He said, what? And they said, and 20% are going to vote for the Communist Party, and they may get back in power. And the oligarchs went to these rich men. They went to Putin and said, they went to Yeltsin and said, look, if you cooperate with us, we'll steal the election for you, and which they did. So, you know, they didn't have honest democracy, and they didn't have honest capitalism. They had white capitalism of a kind that was whiter than when we had the robber barons, unregulated. Ford and Carnegie were making zillions. They were more regulated than in Russia. So the situation was bad, and American influence was low because it was felt that we had supported all this, and they had gone through all this shock therapy. So anyway, the Kremlin had set up under Putin. Now, Putin had put everything back in order in the sense that people were getting their salaries, they were getting their pensions, and when I asked a taxi driver this trip last month, who's going to be the next president, Putin or Medvedev, the taxi driver said, well, in Moscow, you know, we know what's going on. We prefer Medvedev. But in the countryside, Putin is God. Because these people, you know, felt their pensions, their salaries had all been reestablished. They wanted strong leaders. Russia traditionally wants strong leaders and security, whereas Americans, for the last 200 years, assumed that we would have security and stability and wanted freedom and democracy. So Velikov was put in charge of a group called the Public Chamber, and I was asked to give a talk on how to get the Russians to be less apathetic and less passive. And I gave this talk about Americans and Russians should cooperate with each other, but it fell on deaf ears because one Russian got up and said, look, the Americans should keep their nose out of our business. And I said, who is this guy? And they said, oh, that's the grandson of Molotov. So now here's 2011. 5 years later, I'm invited again to help defeat passivity in Russia. On the 5th anniversary of Andrei Sakharov's birthday, I was asked to be a plenary speaker, and I was asked to provide a good theory on how the passivity and apathy in Russia could be stopped. Now, I wasn't asked by the government. I was asked by the dissidents. It was the 90th anniversary of Andrei Sakharov's birthday, and they were having a ceremony in his honor. And so they were thinking in those terms, and they knew all I had done, and they thought maybe Jeremy can do it. And so I was one of the plenary speakers asked to do this. This is the Russian subway. There's been economic recovery. The women are in very short skirts. I asked my wife, how do they get in and out of those? She said, Splendex and zippers. So I sat around La Costa Glen for a few weeks trying to figure out what should I say to this conference. And I came up with this theory. Here's my theory. I said the goals of Andrei Sakharov are not ones that the Russian people really care about. There was a gasp in the audience there because they don't like to hear that, but it is true. The Russian public is not going to stand on street corners calling for democracy. They're not going to stand on street corners calling for environment, and they're not going to stand on street corners calling for human rights. They've been serfs for hundreds of years, and then under the Soviet Union they were suppressed, and this is not their first priorities, and they're working like a dog just to get through the day. But I said, you could get them excited about corruption, because Russia is now 150th out of 180 countries in corruption. That is right near the bottom. They're as corrupt now as African countries and going down in corruption. So while Putin put the country back on its feet, the corruption that is involved here is just gotten worse and worse. And Putin has complained about it, and Medvedev has complained about it. Putin is now the prime minister, Medvedev's now the president. They all complain about it, but they haven't been able to do anything about it. And so I said, look, not only is corruption something you could get people to be not passive about, but in addition, you can't secure any of Andrei Sakharov's goals without defeating corruption, because unless you defeat corruption, the judges will be bought, then you won't have any human rights. The environment will be despoiled by factories paying off people to get the space that they want to despoil, you see? And so human rights and environment and democracy will be sold out too, which it had been. So I said, you got to go for corruption first. Attack corruption first. It was my answer to their plea for a theory. And this talk was very well received. For one thing, I told them, you got to stop all the hot air. There was a lot of hot air at this conference. These dissidents are great on theories, you know, they believe in theories, and they're not great theoreticians. So I said, you got to do something practical, and this is what you should do. Well, it created a stir, and I also explained why they could do it. I said, look, the internet use in Russia is going up 30% a year. So the old folks can't use the internet, but the young ones can. And in the Middle East, we have recently seen that the young people know how to use Facebook and Twitter to organize demonstrations and to, you know, if somebody asks you for a bribe, you can videotape it on your phone and you can audio tape it on your phone and you can make it known to everybody. And so so I said, you can fight corruption nowadays over the coming years by using the internet. And furthermore, the government will be very nervous about your doing this for a lot of reasons, which I won't take the time to explain. But I mean, basically, they're not in favor of a very activist public. But they have to fight corruption, and they can't do it by themselves. And they know that. They need a grassroots movement. So tell the government, you're going to help them fight corruption. What can they do? So that was my theory. I hope you like it. And then I had dinner with the Velikovs, and who had asked me 5 years before to do a similar thing. That's his macaw on the left there. And Velikov, my age, still the president of the Kurchatov Institute. He's probably the most loved scientist in Russia. And so I started telling him my idea, and he seemed hesitant. And then I explained, you know, 30% increase the internet, started giving him some of these facts. And he said, well, you know, maybe we could make this work. And he said his public chamber, which has 126 public interest groups in it, and which he had sent a copy of, you know, the first memoir here was translated into Russian, and he wrote the introduction for it. And so he had circulated it to all the groups in the public chamber, all the 126 heads of groups. And so he knew exactly what I did, and he knew exactly what, I mean, he had asked me to do the same thing 6 years before. And he told me, I'm setting up public interest, I'm setting up chambers, public chambers like the governmental one in regions now, so they're harder to suppress. And I'm going to, you know, do even more. And so that was good. And then I met with this woman who had been at the conference. Her name is Elena Panfilova, and she's the head of the Russian chapter of Transparency International. Transparency International fights corruption everywhere. And she said, oh, your talk is creating quite a stir. And I said, what should be the next steps? What do you think? She's a very good organizer. Unlike the Sakharov fans, she's a very practical woman running a very practical operation. She said, why don't we have a conference on human rights and corruption, how they're related? You know, I said, great. In other words, I'm trying to bring the human rights fans behind an anti-corruption campaign in the name of Andrei Sakharov. My paper had said, why don't we have an Andrei Sakharov coordinating council that will bring together all the groups fighting corruption to share ideas under the banner of Andrei Sakharov's name. And then I began lobbying the Sakharov foundations to do this. So that's the work I'm engaged in right now. So the real question is, can this theory, attack corruption first, save Russia? Can it embolden the human rights groups to turn their attention to corruption? Can it help stir an even larger movement against corruption? And can that provide an environment in Russia where human rights and democracy and environment can be protected? So that's the goal. But I want to mention one other thing happened in this trip. This is the last slide. I took some presidents for Mr. Gorbachev. He's 80 and he was in the hospital, so I didn't see him. But they were having a memorial for this man, Sakharov. The Russians have a habit of memorializing people's birthdays and so on. This was the 10th anniversary of his death. This is 4 pictures about him. And I was asked to give a talk, a few words, while I was there. And that's me speaking to the group. There were 10 people at the table and about 50 people in the background. And this man, Sakharov, he was the inventor in Russia of the new way of thinking. He was the closest advisor to Gorbachev. He was the one that told Gorbachev, free the Eastern European countries, which was a big step towards ending the arms race, you know. And he was the one who encouraged him to pursue democracy and all these other things. And when I spoke, I want to tell you what I said. I said, look, the Cold War went on for 40 years. And during that time, 50,000 nuclear weapons were built. Now, there are only 50 large cities in Russia and only 50 large cities in America, so 50,000 nuclear weapons, any one of which could destroy not only the city but the whole metropolitan area, posed a tremendous threat to mankind. I said, this is the largest threat that mankind has faced in 50,000 years, since mankind left Africa 50,000 years ago and started spreading around the globe. This threat, caused by the Cold War, you may have all forgotten about. But people like me spend 40 years of our life worrying about it and knowing that in 30 minutes, our entire society could be lost forever, and maybe the rest of the world. And I told them that Sakharov's new way of thinking and his boldness in encouraging Gorbachev to follow through, this is what led Russia to drop out of the arms race. Russia was already in terrible economic circumstances. It wasn't the Star Wars threat that stopped them, and it wasn't President Reagan saying, tear down this wall. It was that they were in terrible economic shape, and Gorbachev knew that Russia just couldn't continue like that. And Sakharov helped give him the advice on what to do. They were the challenger in an arms race that couldn't keep up, and they were broken by the economic strains of it. You know, they just couldn't keep up. Anyway, so I honored Sakharov and Gorbachev for dropping out of this arms race and dropping out of this Cold War, which reduced the risk of nuclear war enormously. I presented a second paper at the conference, which will appear in some subsequent talk, on further nuclear disarmament and how to further reduce these risks. But the risks were reduced enormously by the change in the political climate and the fact that Russia is now a capitalist state. So the goal of this talk is to explain, as I hope you noticed, that small things can make big differences, and people should say what they think and should not be intimidated. And that's what I tried to do, and that's what Andrei Sakharov tried to do. And these examples can make an ever larger difference. And just to conclude, when Velikov wrote an introduction to my Russian chapter, Velikov was a very smart man, and he understood things about what I was doing that I didn't understand myself. And he said in the introduction, he said, how can Stone compete with government agencies and with organizations 10 times his size in making change? He said, well, it's because he's a node in a network of activists. And what he meant was, I have an idea, I give it to him, and he gives it to Sakharov, or somebody gives it to somebody else. And these ideas propagate around very rapidly now over the internet. So ideas can make a very large difference. And examples of courage can make a large difference. That's what Andrei Sakharov showed. I mean, he stood up with the whole weight of the Soviet Union on him. And they were forced to capitulate. So there's an important moral lesson in all this. Well, thank you very much. I consider you all part of the intellectual elite for attending these lectures, and hope you found it interesting.